My mother-in-law literally ripped my engagement ring off my finger during Sunday brunch at her apartment, claimed it was too expensive for someone like me to wear, and said I was flaunting my wealth to embarrass her family. Then my billionaire father found out what happened and made one phone call to her property manager that resulted in her getting evicted from her rent-controlled apartment she'd lived in for 15 years, losing her parking spot, and now she's hired some cut-rate lawyer trying to sue us for economic warfare, while convincing half my fiancé's family that I'm a spoiled rich brat who destroyed her life over a piece of jewelry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hey everyone, I'm literally still trembling as I film this because I honestly cannot wrap my head around what my life has become in the past month. I thought I understood what family drama looked like, but this situation has spiraled so far beyond anything I could have ever imagined that I sometimes wonder if I'm living in some twisted reality show. I'm Isabella, I'm 27 years old, and I live here in Rosewood Springs with my fiancé Cameron. What started as an innocent family brunch has turned into a legal catastrophe that's ripped our entire family apart, and I'm still trying to process how we even got to this point. I need to share this story because people keep asking me if the rumors they're hearing around town are true, and honestly, the rumors don't even scratch the surface of how completely unhinged this whole situation really is. My future mother-in-law, Veronica Ashworth, has always been what I'd diplomatically call strong-willed. But what happened 4 weeks ago crossed every single line I didn't even know existed. And when my father found out what she'd done to me, well, let's just say that Veronica discovered very quickly that there are serious consequences to messing with certain people's daughters. I know this sounds like something straight out of a daytime soap opera, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every single word I'm about to tell you actually happened. The ring theft, the brunch from absolute hell, my father's phone call, Veronica losing her apartment, the lawsuit threats, the family choosing sides, all of it. And the worst part? It's not even close to being over. Veronica is still fighting this battle she created, and every single day brings some new level of insanity that I didn't think was humanly possible. Before I jump into the main story, I need you to understand something crucial about my family background, because it's absolutely essential to understanding why this whole thing exploded the way it did. My father, Alexander Montrose, is what you'd call extremely successful. He built his real estate empire from absolutely nothing, starting with a single rental property when I was just a toddler, and now Montrose Holdings is worth approximately $2.8 billion, with luxury properties across 12 major cities. Growing up, I always knew we had money, but my parents worked incredibly hard to keep me grounded. I attended public school through high school, had a part-time job at a local bookstore during summers, and earned my degree in graphic design because I wanted to pursue my passion, not because I had to work for survival. The thing about having a father like mine is that most people don't know about the family connection. I kept my maiden name professionally. Cameron and I live in a modest neighborhood, and we drive practical cars. We're not flashy people at all. My father's wealth has always been this background safety net in my life, something I hoped I'd never need to rely on, but also something that's made me extremely careful about who I trust and why people want to get close to me. That's actually how I knew Cameron was different when we met 3 years ago at a design conference in Harbor City. He had absolutely no idea who my father was, never asked about my family's financial situation, and fell in love with me just for being me. When I finally told him about my father's business about 8 months into our relationship, Cameron was honestly more worried about whether I thought he was with me for the wrong reasons than he was impressed by the family wealth. That's when I knew he was the one. Cameron's family, on the other hand, is what you'd call solidly working class. His father, Robert, works as a shift supervisor at the Rosewood Springs water treatment plant, and Veronica has been a receptionist at various medical offices around town for the past 12 years. They live in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in the Oakwood Gardens complex, drive reliable used cars, and take one vacation every other year to visit Robert's brother in Mountain View. Normal, hard-working people living a comfortable but definitely not extravagant life. When Cameron and I got engaged 18 months ago, I made the mistake of being completely transparent with his parents about my family background. I thought they deserved to know, especially since my father was contributing to our wedding expenses and they'd probably figure it out anyway when they saw the venue we'd booked. Robert took the news pretty well. He was actually relieved that his son had found someone from a stable, successful family. Veronica's reaction was different. At first, she seemed thrilled about having a future daughter-in-law from a wealthy family. She'd make little comments about how nice it must be to never worry about rent money, and how she hoped Cameron and I would be generous with our future children's grandparents. Red flags, but I tried to be understanding. Then came the wedding planning, and Veronica started making suggestions about how we should spend our money. Bigger venue, more expensive catering, upgraded everything. When I gently explained that while my father was generously covering most wedding costs, Cameron and I made our own financial decisions about the details, Veronica's attitude shifted dramatically. She started making passive-aggressive comments about how I was too good for their family, how Cameron was forgetting where he came from, and how she hoped the money wouldn't change him. The worst part was how she'd say these things with this sweet smile, like they were jokes, but everyone could feel the poison underneath. And that ring, the ring that's at the center of this entire disaster, represents everything beautiful about my relationship with Cameron, which is probably why Veronica's obsession with it felt so deeply personal and violating. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What happened at that brunch 4 weeks ago was just the beginning of this nightmare. And honestly, if someone had told me a month ago that my quiet Sunday brunch would end with my future mother-in-law getting evicted and threatening to sue my family, I would have laughed. Now I'm not laughing at all. I'm scared, I'm angry, and I'm completely bewildered by how one moment of greed and entitlement has destroyed so many relationships and caused so much pain. The scariest part? Veronica still doesn't think she did anything wrong, and every single day she finds new ways to escalate this situation. Just yesterday, she called my workplace claiming I was emotionally unstable and dangerous to be around clients. Thank God my boss knows me well enough to see through that nonsense, but the fact that she's trying to destroy my career over this is just, I don't even have words. So buckle up, because this story is about to get absolutely wild, and honestly, I'm still living through it, so I don't even know how it's going to end. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me properly introduce myself and everyone involved in this absolute disaster, because understanding these personalities is crucial to understanding how everything went so catastrophically wrong so fast. First, there's my fiancé Cameron. He's 29, works as a senior project coordinator at Riverside Engineering Solutions here in Rosewood Springs, and he's honestly the most genuine person I've ever met. Cameron is the type of guy who still brings me coffee in bed every Sunday morning, remembers my coworkers' names even though he's only met them once, and has never once asked my father for business advice, connections, or favors, even when we were struggling to save for our apartment deposit. He's got this quiet confidence about him, never tries to prove anything to anyone, and treats everyone with the same respect whether they're a janitor or a CEO. That's actually what first attracted me to me, in a world where so many people change their behavior around me once they find out about my family's money. Cameron has always just been Cameron, but Cameron has one weakness, and that's his mother. Veronica raised him mostly as a single mom for the first 6 years of his life after his biological father walked out on them, and even though Robert stepped up when Cameron was 7 and has been an incredible father figure, Cameron still feels this deep loyalty to Veronica for the sacrifices she made during those early years. She's used that guilt his entire life to manipulate him, and even though he's gotten better at setting boundaries since we got engaged, he still struggles to fully stand up to her when she crosses lines. Then there's Veronica Ashworth herself, age 52, and honestly, where do I even begin? On the surface, Veronica presents herself as this sweet, hardworking single mom turned loving wife who just wants the best for her family. She's about 5'2", always has her auburn hair styled in this perfect bob, and dresses like she's trying to look more expensive than she actually is. You know the type. She volunteers at the local animal rescue, organizes the building's holiday parties every year, and makes these amazing lemon bars that everyone in the neighborhood raves about. If you met her at a coffee shop, you'd probably think she was delightful. But underneath that carefully crafted facade, Veronica is manipulative, entitled, and has this bizarre obsession with status and money that she tries to hide but can't quite manage. She's the type of person who name drops constantly, always mentions when she's bought something designer, even if it's from a discount outlet, and somehow manages to work her financial struggles into every conversation in a way that makes you feel obligated to help her. She's also incredibly possessive of Cameron and has never really accepted that he's an adult with his own life. The interesting thing about Veronica is that she's actually quite intelligent. She's just chosen to use that intelligence for manipulation rather than building something positive for herself. She knows exactly what to say to make people feel guilty, how to play the victim when she's caught doing something wrong, and she's mastered this ability to twist situations so that she somehow ends up being the one who deserves sympathy. It's actually impressive in a terrifying way. Robert, Cameron's stepfather, is Veronica's complete opposite. He's 54, works at the water treatment plant where he's been Employee of the Month probably 30 times, and he's just this solid, dependable guy who minds his own business and treats everyone fairly. Robert genuinely loves Cameron like his own son, and he's never once made Cameron feel like he owed him anything for stepping up when his biological father abandoned them. He's the kind of man who fixes neighbors' plumbing for free, coaches youth soccer on weekends, and always remembers people's anniversaries. The sad thing about Robert is that he's completely blind to Veronica's manipulative side. He sees her as this woman who struggled as a single mom and deserves to be protected and cared for. When Veronica starts her dramatic episodes, Robert immediately jumps into protector mode, which usually means everyone else gets blamed for upsetting her. He's not a bad person, he's actually wonderful, but Veronica has him so thoroughly convinced that she's always the victim that he enables her behavior without even realizing it. Now, my father Alexander is a whole different story. At 55, he's built Montrose Holdings from literally nothing into a real estate empire that owns luxury properties in 12 major cities. But here's the thing about my dad. He didn't get where he is by being nice. He's brilliant, absolutely ruthless in business, and has this ability to see through people's nonsense that's almost supernatural. Growing up, I watched him destroy business partners who tried to cheat him, completely outmaneuver competitors who played dirty, and systematically dismantle people who threatened his family. But with family, Dad is completely different. He's patient, generous, and surprisingly gentle. He taught me to drive, came to every school event, and never once made me feel like I had to earn his love or approval. The flip side is that he's incredibly protective of the people he cares about. My mom always jokes that Dad has two settings, loving family man and corporate predator, with absolutely no middle ground between them. My mother Elena is 53 and works as a senior architect at Coastal Design Associates downtown. She's brilliant, practical, and has this way of cutting through drama with surgical precision. Mom grew up middle class, met Dad when they were both in college, and she's always been very conscious about not letting wealth change who we are as people. She's the one who insisted I go to public school, work summer jobs, and understand the value of money. Mom gets along with most people, but she has zero tolerance for manipulation or fake behavior. The few times she's met Veronica, I could tell she saw right through the act, but Mom's too polite to say anything directly. However, if you push Mom too far, or threaten her family, she can be just as scary as Dad in her own way. Finally, there's me. I'm Isabella Montrose, and I kept my name when I got engaged to Cameron because I wanted to honor my family while building something new with his. I'm 27. I work as a freelance graphic designer specializing in branding for small businesses, and I absolutely love my work. I chose design because I genuinely enjoy the creative process and making a difference for entrepreneurs who are building something from scratch, not because I needed the income. My annual earnings are about $65,000, which is comfortable but not extravagant, and I've always been proud to live on what I earn rather than relying on family money. I'm generally a pretty easygoing person. I avoid conflict when possible, always try to see the best in people, and I tend to give others the benefit of the doubt, sometimes to my own detriment. My friends often tell me I'm too trusting, and Cameron jokes that I could find something nice to say about a serial killer. But I also have boundaries, and once someone crosses them, especially when it comes to family or fairness, I can be surprisingly tough. The thing about growing up wealthy is that you develop this radar for people who want to use you. I've had friends who suddenly became interested in expensive restaurants when they found out about Dad's money, dates who started hinting about trips and gifts, and even professors who began treating me differently once they figured out my family's situation. It's made me cautious about new relationships, but it's also made me incredibly grateful for the people who love me for who I am, not what I can provide. Cameron and I met at a design conference in Harbor City 2.5 years ago. I was presenting on sustainable branding practices for eco-friendly businesses, and he was there because Riverside Engineering was sponsoring the event and needed someone to coordinate their exhibit setup. We ended up talking during a coffee break about how design and engineering could work together to create more environmentally responsible projects, and I was immediately impressed by how thoughtful and genuinely interested he was in my work, even though it wasn't his field. We exchanged numbers supposedly to continue our conversation about sustainable design principles, but really because there was this immediate connection between us. Cameron called me 4 days later to ask if I wanted to get dinner and continue our discussion about green building practices. We both knew it was a date. What I loved about Cameron from the beginning was how normal he made me feel. He didn't Google me, didn't ask probing questions about my family, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about design, my hobbies, and my dreams for the future. When I told him about my father's business 8 months into our relationship, Cameron's first reaction was concern that I might think he was dating me for the wrong reasons, not excitement about what the connection might mean for him. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed, and during that time Cameron met my parents several times but never once asked my father for business advice, connections, or favors. Dad was impressed by this and Mom absolutely adored Cameron from their first meeting. They could see that he loved me for me, not for what our family could provide, and that meant everything to them. This is the foundation you need to understand what happened 4 weeks ago at what was supposed to be a simple family brunch, and how one moment of greed and entitlement set off a chain reaction that would destroy relationships and change all our lives forever. Before I dive into the main story, I need you to understand something crucial about my family's situation and why this whole thing exploded the way it did, because the background details are absolutely essential to understanding the nuclear-level destruction that followed. My father's real estate empire isn't just about money, it's about power, connections, and the kind of influence that can reshape entire neighborhoods with a single phone call. Montrose Holdings doesn't just own luxury properties, they control rental markets in some of the most competitive cities in the country. When Dad decides someone shouldn't have access to housing in certain areas, they simply don't. It's that straightforward. Growing up, I always knew we had money, but what I didn't fully understand until I was older was the sheer scope of Dad's influence. He sits on city planning committees, has direct relationships with property management companies across 12 states, and owns enough commercial real estate that entire business districts depend on his approval for their operations. The thing about having that level of power is that most people don't realize it exists until they cross someone who has it. Dad has always been very careful to keep his business life separate from our family life, partly to protect us and partly because he understands that wielding that kind of influence requires discretion. But there's another side to this that I've tried very hard to keep separate from my relationship with Cameron. My father didn't just build his empire through smart investments and good business decisions. He built it by understanding that in real estate, information is everything, and leverage is the only currency that really matters. Dad has files on every major property owner, developer, and management company in his markets. He knows who's behind on their taxes, who's violating building codes, who's operating without proper permits, and who's been cutting corners on maintenance. It's not blackmail, it's business intelligence, and it's perfectly legal, but it's also incredibly powerful. When someone threatens his family, Dad doesn't just respond with money, he responds with systematic, devastating precision that dismantles their entire world from the ground up. I've seen it happen twice in my life. Once when I was 16 and a business partner tried to steal one of Dad's commercial developments through fraudulent contracts. Within 6 months, that man lost his business license, his properties were foreclosed on, and he was facing federal fraud charges. The second time was when I was in college, and a professor began sexually harassing me, thinking my family's wealth made me an easy target. That professor not only lost his job, but found himself permanently blacklisted from academic positions anywhere in the country. His published research was mysteriously scrutinized for plagiarism, his professional references dried up, and he eventually had to leave the state to find work as a substitute teacher. Dad never told me exactly what he did in either case, but the message was clear. Threatening Vincent Montrose's family has consequences that extend far beyond what most people can imagine. This is the background that makes what happened with Veronica so much more significant than just a family dispute. She didn't just cross a line with me, she crossed a line with someone whose entire life's work has been built around protecting what belongs to him. But here's the thing that makes this situation even more complex. I've spent my entire adult life trying to build relationships and a career that exist independently of my father's influence. I wanted Cameron to love me for who I am, not what my family could do for him. I wanted my design clients to hire me because of my work, not because they hoped it would give them access to Montrose Holdings. I've been incredibly careful to keep my professional life separate from my family's business empire. My design studio operates under my name only. I've never asked Dad for client referrals, and most of my business contacts have no idea who my father is. This independence has always been important to me, but it also meant that when Veronica started her campaign of manipulation and harassment, I initially tried to handle it without involving my parents. I thought I could manage the situation through normal channels, setting boundaries, having conversations with Cameron, maybe some family counseling if things got really bad. What I didn't anticipate was how completely unhinged Veronica would become, or how her obsession with my engagement ring would escalate into criminal behavior. The ring itself represents something much deeper than just an expensive piece of jewelry, and understanding its significance is crucial to understanding why Veronica's attack felt so violating and personal. When Cameron decided he wanted to propose, he spent months researching engagement rings, not because he didn't know what I'd like, but because he wanted to create something that would tell the story of our relationship in a way that had nothing to do with my family's wealth. He'd noticed that I always admired vintage jewelry, especially pieces from the 1940s and 1950s, and he loved how my eyes lit up whenever we walked past antique shops or estate jewelry displays. But Cameron, being Cameron, he didn't want to just buy something that already existed. He wanted to create something that was uniquely ours. He found a jeweler in Harbor City named Sofia Benedetti, an elderly Italian woman who specialized in custom pieces inspired by vintage designs. Cameron spent hours with Sofia, describing not just what he wanted the ring to look like, but what he wanted it to represent. He told Sofia about how we met, about my love for classic aesthetics, about how he wanted the ring to symbolize both timeless elegance and our modern partnership. What they created together was absolutely breathtaking. The center stone is a 1.8-carat round diamond, perfectly cut and completely flawless, set in a white gold band with intricate vintage-inspired detailing. Surrounding the center diamond are 12 smaller diamonds arranged in a flower pattern that's both classic and contemporary. The band itself is a work of art, with delicate engraving and mill-grain detailing that catches the light from every angle. But the most special part of the ring isn't visible to anyone but me and Cameron. On the inside of the band, Sofia engraved a tiny lighthouse, a symbol Cameron chose because he said I was his beacon, the person who helped him navigate life's challenges and find his way home. Below the lighthouse are our initials and the coordinates of the exact spot on Moonrise Beach where we had our first real conversation about building a future together. The ring cost $22,000, which I know sounds like a lot of money, but you have to understand what that represented for Cameron. His salary at the time was about $78,000 a year, so this ring cost nearly 30% of his annual income before taxes. He saved for almost 2.5 years, working overtime whenever possible, taking on freelance engineering projects on weekends, and making sacrifices that I didn't even know about until after we were engaged. I later learned that Cameron had been bringing lunch from home every single day for over a year to save money. He'd canceled his gym membership, stopped going out with friends, sold his gaming console, and even moved to a smaller, cheaper apartment to put every possible dollar toward the ring fund. When his coworkers would suggest grabbing drinks after work or going to a baseball game, Cameron would decline, making excuses about being tired or having other commitments because he didn't want to admit he was saving every penny for an engagement ring. The most touching part was that Cameron never once considered asking my father for help or advice about the ring, even though he knew Dad could have easily afforded something much more expensive. Cameron wanted this to be entirely his gift to me, earned through his own hard work and sacrifice. He later told me that every extra hour he worked, every sacrifice he made, felt meaningful because it was all building toward the moment he could ask me to marry him. When Cameron finally proposed on that beach in Moonrise Cove on a Saturday evening in September, the ring was even more beautiful than I could have imagined. But what made me cry wasn't just the stunning design. It was learning about everything he'd done to make it possible. The ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a physical representation of Cameron's love, dedication, and commitment to building our life together with his own hands and heart. From the moment I started wearing the ring, people noticed it. It's the kind of piece that catches light and draws attention, and I received compliments constantly. Friends would ask to see it up close, coworkers would admire it during meetings, and strangers would sometimes comment on it in grocery store lines. I was proud to wear it, not because of its monetary value, but because of the love story it represented. Veronica's reaction to the ring was complicated from the very beginning. When Cameron first showed it to his parents after our engagement, she made all the appropriate comments about how beautiful it was and how lucky I was to have such a thoughtful fiancé. But I noticed she kept asking detailed questions about the specifications, the carat weight, the cut quality, where it was purchased, how much it cost. Cameron deflected most of these questions, but Veronica was persistent. During our engagement party at my parents' house, I caught Veronica taking photos of my ring when she thought no one was looking. When I asked her about it, she said she wanted to show her sister how beautiful it was, but something about the way she was examining it felt strange. She held my hand much longer than necessary, turning it to catch the light from different angles and asking if she could try it on just to see how it looks. I politely declined, explaining that the ring was sized specifically for me and would probably be too small for her fingers anyway. Veronica's expression changed for just a moment, a flash of something that looked almost angry, before she smiled and said she understood completely. This was the foundation that everything else was built on, a ring that represented pure love and sacrifice, a family with unlimited power and resources, and a woman whose obsession with status and control was about to collide with forces she couldn't possibly understand. What happened next would test every relationship, reveal everyone's true character, and ultimately destroy the carefully constructed life that Veronica had built through years of manipulation and lies. Cameron proposed on Moonrise Beach on a perfect September evening that I'll remember for the rest of my life, not just because of the ring or the romantic setting, but because of how he made me understand that our love was worth fighting for, no matter what obstacles we might face. The proposal itself was everything I could have dreamed of, but it was the months leading up to it that really showed me who Cameron was as a person, and why our relationship was built on something much stronger than attraction or convenience. About 6 months before he proposed, I started noticing changes in Cameron's behavior that worried me at first. He was working later hours, declining social invitations, and seemed stressed about money in a way he'd never been before. He stopped suggesting dinner dates at our favorite restaurants, opted for home-cooked meals instead of takeout, and even mentioned that he was thinking about getting a second job. I was concerned that maybe he was having doubts about our relationship, or feeling pressure about my family's wealth. One evening when he declined another invitation to go out with friends, I finally asked him directly if everything was okay between us. That's when Cameron told me he was saving for something important, something that meant everything to him, but he couldn't tell me what it was yet. He asked me to trust him and be patient for just a little while longer. "Isabella," he said, taking my hands in his, "I know I've been different lately, but it's because I'm working towards something that I hope will make you as happy as you've made me. Can you give me a few more months to surprise you?" The sincerity in his eyes and the way he asked for my trust, rather than demanding it, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about doubts or pressure. This was about Cameron planning something special for us. Over the following months, I watched Cameron make sacrifices that he thought I didn't notice. When we went grocery shopping, he'd suggest store brands instead of name brands. When we talked about weekend plans, he'd propose hiking or free museum days instead of movies or concerts. He started bringing lunch to work every day, claiming he was trying to eat healthier, but I noticed the lunches were always simple sandwiches or pasta salads. What struck me most was that Cameron never complained about these changes or made me feel like they were sacrifices. He genuinely seemed happy to find creative ways to have fun together that didn't cost money, and he never once made me feel guilty about my family's wealth or suggested that I should contribute more to our expenses. The most touching moment came when Cameron's old college roommate invited us to a weekend ski trip with their friend group. I knew Cameron loved skiing and hadn't been in over 2 years because of the expense. When he declined the invitation, his friend Marcus pressed him about it. "Come on, man," Marcus said. "It's been forever since we've all gotten together. Isabella's family probably has a ski house anyway, right? You guys could probably get us a discount somewhere." I watched Cameron's face tighten, and I was about to speak up when he said firmly, "Isabella's family's money isn't mine to spend, and I'm not interested in using her connections for personal gain. We'll plan our own ski trip when the timing is right for us." The way he protected both my privacy and our relationship's integrity in that moment showed me everything I needed to know about the man I was falling in love with. Cameron wasn't just dating me despite my family's wealth. He was actively working to ensure that our relationship existed independently of it. When he finally proposed on that beach, with the sun setting behind him and the ring sparkling in the golden light, Cameron gave this speech that still gives me chills when I think about it. "Isabella," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "2.5 years ago, I met someone who changed everything I thought I knew about love and partnership. You make me want to be the best version of myself. Not because you demand it, but because your kindness and strength inspire me to rise to your level. I've spent the last 1.5 years working toward this moment, not just saving for this ring, but becoming the kind of man who deserves to call you his wife. Every sacrifice I made, every extra hour I worked, every dollar I saved was worth it, because it brought me closer to asking you the most important question of my life. I don't want to marry you because of where you come from or what your family can provide. I want to marry you because you're brilliant, compassionate, funny, and you make every day feel like an adventure. I want to build a life with you that we create together, with our own hands and our own dreams." Then he got down on one knee and said, "Isabella Montrose, will you marry me and help me become the best man I can be?" I was crying so hard I could barely say yes, but it wasn't just because of the beautiful proposal. It was because Cameron had just promised me something I'd never thought I'd find. A partner who loved me for exactly who I was, independent of everything else. The ring was absolutely perfect, and when I learned later about all the work and sacrifice that had gone into it, I fell in love with him all over again. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was proof of Cameron's commitment to building our future together on his own terms. But what made our relationship foundation even stronger was how we handled the integration of our families. Cameron was nervous about meeting my parents, not because he was intimidated by their wealth, but because he wanted them to see him as worthy of their daughter. The first dinner at my parents' house was a revelation. Instead of trying to impress Dad with business talk or asking about investment opportunities, Cameron spent the evening asking Mom about her architecture projects and sharing stories about his engineering work. He was genuinely interested in their lives as people, not as sources of wealth or connections. Dad later told me that he was impressed by Cameron's authenticity and lack of agenda. "Most people who meet me want something," Dad said. "Cameron just wanted to get to know us because we're important to you. That's the mark of a good man." Mom was even more enthusiastic. "He looks at you like you hung the moon," she told me after that first dinner. "And more importantly, he talks to you like an equal partner, not like a prize he's won. That's rare, honey." My parents' approval meant everything to me, not because I needed their permission, but because I wanted the people I loved most to love each other. When it came time to introduce my parents to Cameron's family, things became more complicated. Robert was genuinely pleased to meet them and treated them with the same respect he showed everyone else. He asked thoughtful questions about their work and shared stories about his own career without any sense of inadequacy or resentment. Veronica's behavior was different from the start. She was overly deferential to my parents, almost fawning in her attention to them, while simultaneously making subtle digs about how overwhelming it must be for Cameron to adjust to such different circumstances. During that first family dinner, Veronica made several comments that set off alarm bells for me. When Dad mentioned a recent business trip to Chicago, Veronica immediately jumped in with, "Oh, that must be so nice to travel for business. Robert and I haven't been anywhere in years, but I suppose that's just the difference between our worlds." When Mom complimented the meal Veronica had prepared, she responded with, "Well, I do my best with what we can afford. It's not fancy like what you're probably used to, but we make do." Each comment was designed to highlight the economic differences between our families, while positioning herself as the humble, hardworking victim of circumstances beyond her control. But what disturbed me most was how Veronica kept steering conversations toward money and lifestyle differences. She'd ask pointed questions about my parents' house, their cars, their vacation plans, always with this wide-eyed expression that was supposed to convey innocent curiosity but felt more like intelligence gathering. Cameron noticed it too, and he started redirecting conversations away from financial topics whenever Veronica brought them up. "Mom," he'd say gently, "I'm sure they didn't come here to talk about money. Tell them about your volunteer work at the animal rescue instead." But Veronica would always find a way to circle back to wealth-related topics, and I could see my parents exchanging glances across the table. They were too polite to say anything directly, but I knew they were picking up on the same uncomfortable undercurrents that I was sensing. After that dinner, Mom pulled me aside and said, "Honey, I think Cameron's mother might have some complicated feelings about our family's situation. Just be aware and set boundaries if you need to." Dad was more direct. "That woman is keeping score," he said quietly. She's measuring everything we have against what she has, and she's not happy with the math. Watch yourself around her." I tried to dismiss their concerns at first, telling myself that Veronica was probably just nervous about the social differences and would relax once she got to know us better. I wanted to believe that her comments came from insecurity rather than resentment, and that time would solve the problem. Cameron was caught in the middle, trying to manage his mother's behavior while building a relationship with my family. He started having private conversations with Veronica about appropriate topics for family gatherings, but she would always claim she was just being friendly and couldn't understand why everyone was so sensitive. The foundation of our relationship was solid. Cameron and I trusted each other completely, loved each other deeply, and were committed to building a life together based on our own values and efforts. But the external pressures from Veronica's manipulative behavior were already starting to create stress that would only get worse as time went on. Looking back now, I can see that Veronica was studying us from the very beginning, gathering information about our relationship, our finances, and our family dynamics that she would later use as weapons against us. She was building a case for why Cameron deserved more than I was giving him, why our relationship was somehow unfair to him, and why she, as his mother, had the right to intervene. But at the time, I was still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, and hoping that patience and kindness would eventually win her over. I had no idea that Veronica wasn't looking for acceptance or understanding. She was looking for leverage, and she was about to find it in my engagement ring. Over the following months after our engagement, Veronica's behavior began to shift in ways that were subtle at first, but looking back now, I can see were the early stages of what would eventually become a full-scale campaign of manipulation and harassment. It started with what I initially dismissed as typical future mother-in-law adjustment issues. Veronica began making comments about wedding planning that seemed helpful on the surface, but carried underlying messages about control and financial expectations. About 3 weeks after our engagement, she called me directly for the first time. "Isabella, honey," she said in that overly sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "I've been thinking about your wedding plans, and I just want you to know that Robert and I want to contribute however we can." When I thanked her and explained that my father had generously offered to cover the major expenses, Veronica's tone shifted slightly. "Oh well, that's very generous of him, of course, but you know, there are family traditions that money can't buy." Cameron's grandmother's wedding dress is still in my closet, perfectly preserved. I've always dreamed of seeing my future daughter-in-law wear it. The dress suggestion was accompanied by a detailed story about family history and tradition that felt more like emotional manipulation than genuine sharing. When I gently explained that I'd already fallen in love with a dress I'd found with my mother, Veronica's voice became cooler. "I see," she said. "Well, I suppose when you have unlimited resources, family traditions don't seem as important. I just hope Cameron doesn't forget where he comes from with all this extravagance." That phone call established a pattern that would define our interactions for months to come. Veronica would make suggestions or requests framed as family traditions or mother-in-law privileges, and when I politely declined or explained our existing plans, she would respond with passive-aggressive comments about money changing people or Cameron losing touch with his roots. The wedding dress incident was followed by suggestions about the venue. Cameron's cousin got married at the community center, and it was lovely. Sometimes simple is better than showy. The catering: "I make a wonderful lasagna that could feed the whole wedding party for a fraction of what you're probably spending." And even the guest list: "I hope you're not planning anything too elaborate. Our family appreciates simple celebrations." Each suggestion came with the implication that our actual plans were somehow excessive, inappropriate, or evidence that I was corrupting Cameron with materialistic values. But Veronica's most persistent focus became my engagement ring. What started as innocent compliments gradually evolved into an uncomfortable obsession that made me increasingly uneasy. During family dinners, I noticed that Veronica's eyes would immediately go to my left hand whenever I arrived. She'd comment on the ring every single time, always with variations of the same observations about how stunning it was, how lucky I was, and how hard Cameron must have worked to afford something so beautiful. The comments about Cameron's sacrifice were particularly pointed. Veronica would bring up his savings efforts in front of other family members, describing in detail how he'd given up his social life and hobbies to buy the ring, always with this tone that suggested I should feel guilty about accepting such an expensive gift. "You know," she said during one particularly uncomfortable family barbecue, "Cameron sold his motorcycle to help pay for that ring. He loved that bike, rode it everywhere for years. but he wanted to give you something special, more than he wanted to keep something that made him happy. The way she phrased it made it sound like I'd demanded he sell his motorcycle, when in reality I hadn't even known about it until she mentioned it. When I expressed surprise and told Cameron later that I would have been just as happy with a less expensive ring, he assured me that every sacrifice had been his choice and that seeing me wear the ring made it all worthwhile. But Veronica's comments had planted a seed of guilt that she continued to water at every opportunity. The ring obsession escalated to physical behavior that crossed boundaries I didn't even know existed. During family gatherings, Veronica would find excuses to touch my hand, hold it longer than necessary when greeting me, and examine the ring up close while making detailed observations about the cut, clarity, and setting. "May I?" she'd ask, reaching for my hand before I could respond, then spending long minutes turning my hand in the light and making comments about the craftsmanship. "Sofia Benedetti really is an artist," she'd say. "This must have cost, well, I suppose it's rude to speculate, but it's certainly a significant investment." When I tried to pull my hand away after a reasonable amount of time, Veronica would hold on just a little too long, making comments like, "Just one more second, I want to see how the light catches the side stones." The forced intimacy of these examinations made me deeply uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause family drama by making a scene. Cameron noticed my discomfort and started redirecting his mother's attention when she began her ring examinations, but Veronica would just wait for opportunities when he wasn't watching. Things took a more disturbing turn when Veronica began making comments about ring security and insurance. She'd bring up stories about engagement rings being stolen, damaged, or lost, always with pointed looks at my hand. "You know Isabella," she said during one family dinner. "I read an article about a woman who lost her engagement ring at the beach. 2 carats, just like yours, gone forever in the sand. It made me think about how careful you have to be with something so valuable." These safety lectures became increasingly frequent and specific. Veronica would suggest that I shouldn't wear the ring to certain places or during certain activities, always framing her advice as concern for the ring's protection rather than attempts to control my behavior. "I hope you don't wear that to work," she said one Sunday. "Graphic design involves a lot of hand movement, doesn't it? And with children around, I assume some of your clients have children who might grab at shiny things. It would be terrible if something happened to it." When I explained that I was always careful with the ring and had never had any problems, Veronica would respond with stories about accidents that could happen to anyone, always emphasizing the irreplaceable nature of the loss. But the most unsettling development was Veronica's apparent research into the ring's specifics. She began making comments that suggested she knew details about the ring that I'd never shared with her. During a family dinner in November, she made a casual comment about Sofia Benedetti's reputation in the jewelry community and mentioned that rings from her shop typically held their value well in resale markets. When I asked how she knew about Sofia's reputation, Veronica claimed she'd just been curious and had looked up the jeweler online. But later conversations revealed knowledge that couldn't have come from a simple Google search. She knew details about the specific setting style, the diamond grating, and even mentioned the lighthouse engraving on the inside of the band, something that Cameron and I had never told anyone about. When I asked Cameron if he'd shared those details with his mother, he was adamant that he hadn't. "I never told her about the engraving," he said, clearly troubled. "That's between us. How could she possibly know about that?" The only explanation was that Veronica had somehow examined the ring more closely than I'd realized, possibly when I'd briefly removed it to wash dishes or during one of her forced examinations when I was distracted by conversation. The knowledge that she'd been studying my ring in secret, memorizing details that were meant to be private between Cameron and me, felt like a violation that was hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Veronica's behavior also began extending beyond the ring to other aspects of our relationship and future plans. She started making comments about how we were spending our money, questioning decisions about everything from our apartment lease to our vacation plans. "Cameron mentioned you're thinking about going to Italy for your honeymoon," she said during one family gathering. "That must be nice to have that kind of discretionary income. Robert and I went to Niagara Falls for our honeymoon and had a wonderful time. Sometimes the most meaningful experiences don't require expensive travel." The implication was always the same. We were being frivolous with money that could be better used elsewhere, and our choices reflected poorly on our values and priorities. But what made these comments particularly insidious was how Veronica delivered them. She'd speak with this concerned, motherly tone that made it difficult to object without seeming defensive or ungrateful. When Cameron tried to redirect these conversations, she'd act hurt and confused about why he was being so sensitive about family discussions. The manipulation was sophisticated and persistent. Veronica was systematically undermining our decisions, questioning our judgment, and creating an atmosphere where we constantly felt like we had to justify our choices to her. Looking back, I can see that this period was Veronica's testing phase. She was pushing boundaries to see how much interference we'd tolerate, gathering information about our vulnerabilities, and establishing patterns of behavior that she hoped would normalize increasingly inappropriate intrusions into our lives. She was also building a narrative in her own mind and with extended family members about how Cameron was being changed by wealth, how I was leading him away from his family values, and how she, as his mother, had both the right and the responsibility to intervene for his own good. The most chilling realization, looking back, is that Veronica was planning something during this entire period. Every comment about the ring, every boundary crossed, every piece of information gathered was building towards some kind of confrontation that she believed would give her control over the situation. What I didn't understand then was that Veronica had already decided that my engagement ring represented everything she resented about our relationship and my family's influence on Cameron. In her mind, taking the ring wouldn't just be theft, it would be justice, reclaiming something that rightfully belonged in her family rather than on the finger of someone she'd convinced herself didn't deserve it. The warning signs were all there, but like most people facing manipulation from someone who's supposed to be family, I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt and hoping that patience and kindness would eventually win her over. I was wrong, and that mistake would cost me more than I could have ever imagined. As winter turned to spring, Veronica's behavior escalated from uncomfortable comments to active surveillance and increasingly aggressive boundary violations that made me feel like I was being hunted in my own life. It started with what I initially thought were coincidental encounters around Rosewood Springs. I'd be at the grocery store and suddenly spot Veronica in the same aisle, acting surprised to see me but immediately launching into pointed conversations about my purchases. "Oh my Isabella, what a coincidence," she'd say, her eyes scanning my cart while speaking. "I see you're buying the organic vegetables. Those are so expensive. I stick to the regular ones. Robert says food is food and we can't afford to be fancy about everything." These chance encounters happened with increasing frequency at the coffee shop where I met clients, the dry cleaner where I picked up Cameron's work clothes, and even at the bank where I handled business deposits. Each time, Veronica would act delighted to see me but immediately steer conversations toward money, spending habits, or observations about my daily routine. When I mentioned these encounters to Cameron, he found them odd but suggested maybe his mother was just trying to bond with me by showing interest in my life. "She's probably feeling left out," he said. "Maybe she's trying too hard to be part of our world." But the encounters became too frequent and too specific to be coincidental. Veronica seemed to know details about my schedule that I'd never shared with her. She'd appear at the farmer's market exactly when I was picking up flowers for a client presentation, or show up at the post office right when I was mailing design portfolios. The most unsettling incident happened on a Tuesday morning, when I was meeting a potential client at Riverside Cafe downtown. I arrived early to review my presentation materials and was shocked to see Veronica already seated at a corner table with a clear view of where I was sitting. When she spotted me, she waved enthusiastically and came over to my table uninvited. "Isabella, what a wonderful surprise. I was just having coffee with my friend Martha. Oh, she had to leave suddenly, but this is perfect timing. I'd been wanting to chat with you." She sat down across from me and immediately began asking detailed questions about my work, my clients, and my design process. When I mentioned I was waiting for a client meeting, her eyes lit up with interest. "Oh, how exciting. What kind of client? Is it a big project? I bet you charge quite a bit for your services. Graphic design must be very lucrative these days." When my client arrived, Veronica made no move to leave. Instead, she introduced herself as Cameron's mother and began asking my client personal questions about their business and budget. I was mortified by her intrusion but couldn't figure out how to politely ask her to leave without creating a scene. The client meeting was awkward and uncomfortable, with Veronica inserting herself into conversations about design concepts and making inappropriate comments about pricing. After she finally left, my client asked if I always brought family members to business meetings, clearly concerned about professionalism. I apologized profusely and managed to salvage the meeting, but I was furious about Veronica's interference in my professional life. When I told Cameron about the incident, he was finally ready to acknowledge that his mother's behavior was crossing serious lines. "That's completely inappropriate," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I'll talk to her immediately. She has no right to interfere with your work or embarrass you in front of clients." But when Cameron confronted Veronica about the cafe incident, her response was a masterclass in manipulation and victim playing. She claimed she'd been at the cafe first, having coffee with a friend, and had only approached me to be polite. She said she was hurt that Cameron would accuse her of deliberate interference when she was just trying to be supportive of my career. "I thought Isabella would appreciate having family show interest in her work," she told Cameron with tears in her eyes. "I guess I was wrong to think I was welcome in her professional life. I'll know better next time." Cameron returned from that conversation feeling guilty for confronting his mother and uncertain about whether her behavior was really as problematic as I'd described. Veronica had successfully turned herself into the victim of our overreaction to her innocent attempt at family bonding. But the professional interference was just the beginning. Veronica's surveillance expanded to our apartment building, where neighbors began mentioning that they'd seen her in the parking lot and hallways at odd hours. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the hall from us, pulled me aside one evening to ask if everything was okay. "I've seen your mother-in-law around the building quite a bit lately," she said carefully. "Sometimes early in the morning when you and Cameron have already left for work. Is she helping with something?" When I asked Mrs. Chen for specifics, her information was disturbing. Veronica had been seen trying door handles in our hallway, claiming to Mrs. Chen that she was checking to make sure our door was properly locked for security reasons. She'd also been observed looking through the lobby mailboxes and had asked the building maintenance staff detailed questions about our apartment's layout and amenities. The most alarming revelation came when Mrs. Chen mentioned that Veronica had asked her about our daily schedules, claiming she wanted to surprise us with a visit, but didn't want to catch us at an inconvenient time. "She seemed very interested in what time you both leave for work and when you usually come home," Mrs. Chen said. "I didn't give her any specific information, but I thought you should know she was asking." When I confronted Cameron with this information, he was finally forced to acknowledge that his mother's behavior had gone far beyond normal family concern into stalking territory. We decided to change our locks and inform the building management that Veronica should not be given access to our apartment or information about our schedules without our explicit permission. But Veronica's response to these boundary-setting measures was to escalate her behavior even further. She began calling Cameron at work multiple times a day, claiming various emergencies that required his immediate attention. These emergencies ranged from plumbing problems that turned out to be minor leaks to health scares that resolved themselves by the time Cameron could respond. The pattern was clear. Veronica was creating crises to maintain constant contact with Cameron and to disrupt our normal routines. When Cameron started screening her calls, she began contacting his coworkers and supervisor, claiming she couldn't reach her son and was worried about his well-being. Cameron's boss, Mr. Thompson, eventually called him into his office to address the situation. "Cameron, I need to talk to you about the personal calls we've been receiving," he said. "Your mother has contacted our main line 6 times this week, claiming various emergencies. It's becoming disruptive to the workplace." The professional embarrassment of having his mother's behavior affect his work reputation was the final straw for Cameron. He called Veronica and told her in no uncertain terms that her constant emergency calls were inappropriate and had to stop immediately. "Mom, you're affecting my job," he said firmly. "If you have a real emergency, call 911. If you need to talk to me, send a text and I'll call you back when I'm available. You cannot keep calling my workplace with fake emergencies." Veronica's response was explosive. She accused Cameron of being brainwashed by me and my family's influence, claimed that he'd never spoken to her so harshly before our relationship, and declared that she was losing her son to people who didn't understand the importance of family. The phone call ended with Veronica sobbing dramatically and hanging up on Cameron, but the peace didn't last long. Within hours, she began a new campaign that was even more invasive and disturbing than her previous behavior. She started showing up at my design studio, which operated out of a shared creative space downtown. Unlike the cafe incident, these weren't coincidental encounters. Veronica would arrive and ask the receptionist to let me know that Cameron's mother was there to see me. The first time this happened, I was in the middle of a client presentation and had to excuse myself to deal with Veronica's unexpected visit. She claimed she'd been in the neighborhood and wanted to take me to lunch to discuss wedding planning. When I explained that I was working and couldn't leave, Veronica became agitated. "Isabella, surely your work can wait a few minutes for family," she said loudly enough for my clients to hear. Cameron's grandmother's china pattern won't select itself. I was forced to have a brief conversation about china patterns in the lobby of my professional workspace, while my clients waited. All because Veronica had created a situation where refusing to engage would have looked unprofessional and rude. But the studio visits became a regular occurrence, each one timed to maximize disruption and embarrassment. Veronica would arrive during client meetings, presentation deadlines, or important phone calls, always with some urgent family matter that supposedly couldn't wait. The other creatives in the shared space began making comments about my demanding mother-in-law and suggesting that I needed to set better boundaries between my personal and professional life. The implication was that I was allowing family drama to interfere with business, when in reality I was being stalked and harassed. The most disturbing incident at the studio happened when I returned from lunch to find Veronica in my work area, going through my design portfolios and client files. When I asked what she was doing, she claimed she'd been waiting for me and had gotten bored, so she'd decided to look at my work. "I hope you don't mind," she said, continuing to flip through confidential client materials. "I wanted to understand what kind of design work commands such high fees. Some of these logos seem quite simple for what you probably charge." The violation of client confidentiality and professional privacy was shocking, but what disturbed me most was Veronica's complete lack of understanding about why her behavior was inappropriate. In her mind, she had the right to access any aspect of my life that interested her, regardless of professional boundaries or privacy concerns. When I firmly told her that client files were confidential and asked her to leave my work area, Veronica acted hurt and confused. "Isabella, I'm going to be your mother-in-law," she said. "Surely that means we don't need to have secrets from each other." That evening, I told Cameron that his mother's workplace harassment had to stop immediately, or I would be forced to file a formal complaint. The situation was affecting my professional reputation and could potentially cost me clients. Cameron was appalled by his mother's behavior and promised to have a serious conversation with her about respecting professional boundaries. But I could see the toll that constantly managing his mother's inappropriate behavior was taking on him. He was exhausted from the constant crisis management, embarrassed by her public scenes, and frustrated by her refusal to accept any boundaries or limits on her behavior. Our relationship was solid, but the external pressure was becoming overwhelming. What we didn't realize was that all of this escalation was building towards something much worse. Veronica wasn't just testing boundaries or seeking attention, she was systematically mapping our vulnerabilities and preparing for a confrontation that would make all her previous behavior seem mild by comparison. After Cameron's firm conversation with Veronica about her workplace harassment and professional boundary violations, something unexpected happened. She completely disappeared from our lives for exactly 2 weeks. No surprise visits to my studio, no coincidental encounters at the grocery store, no emergency phone calls to Cameron's office, no sightings in our apartment building. It was as if she had simply vanished, and for the first time in months, Cameron and I could breathe normally again. At first, we were both suspicious of the sudden peace. "This feels too easy," I told Cameron after our first Veronica-free week. "People don't just change their behavior overnight, especially when they've been escalating for months." Cameron agreed, but he also seemed relieved to have his mother finally respecting the boundaries they'd discussed. "Maybe she finally realized how serious I was," he said hopefully. "She's probably taking time to think about her actions and figure out how to rebuild our relationship in a healthier way." Robert called Cameron during the second week to check in, and when Cameron asked about Veronica's unusual absence from our lives, Robert seemed genuinely pleased. "She's been keeping herself busy with volunteer work and some spring cleaning projects," he said. "I think your conversation really got through to her. She's been talking about wanting to start fresh with you and Isabella." The idea that Veronica was using this time for self-reflection and genuine change was appealing, but something about the complete silence felt wrong to me. In my experience, people who had been as obsessive and boundary-crossing as Veronica didn't just stop cold turkey unless they were planning something else. But as the days passed without incident, I started to let my guard down. The relief of being able to work without interruption, go grocery shopping without surveillance, and come home without finding Veronica lurking in our hallway was so profound that I began to hope maybe Cameron was right. Maybe his firm conversation had finally penetrated her delusions and forced her to recognize how inappropriate her behavior had become. During those 2 peaceful weeks, Cameron and I were able to focus on our relationship and wedding planning without the constant stress of managing his mother's intrusions. We had romantic dinners without worrying about surprise visits, made weekend plans without considering how to avoid Veronica's surveillance rotes, and actually enjoyed family time with my parents without the anxiety of wondering what dramatic scene we'd have to manage afterward. "This is what normal feels like," I told Cameron one evening as we cooked dinner together in our apartment. I'd almost forgotten what it was like to live without constantly looking over my shoulder. Cameron wrapped his arms around me from behind as I stirred pasta sauce. "I'm sorry it took me so long to set firm boundaries with her," he said quietly. "I should have protected you from her behavior months ago. I kept thinking she'd adjust on her own, but I see now that she needed clear consequences to understand how serious this was." The conversation felt like a turning point in our relationship. Cameron had finally acknowledged the full extent of his mother's inappropriate behavior and taken responsibility for enabling it for too long. For the first time since our engagement, I felt like we were truly united in managing external pressures. We used the peaceful period to reconnect with friends we'd been avoiding because of Veronica's unpredictable interruptions. We had dinner with my college roommate Sarah and her husband, went to a baseball game with Cameron's work colleagues, and even planned a weekend trip to Harbor City to visit the botanical gardens where we'd first talked about building a future together. "It's like we're getting our life back," Cameron said as we walked through the same gardens where we'd had our first serious conversation about love and commitment. "I feel like I can finally relax and just enjoy being engaged to you without constantly worrying about what crisis my mother might create next." But even during those happy moments, I noticed that I was still unconsciously checking my surroundings for signs of Veronica's presence. The weeks of surveillance and harassment had created a hyper-vigilance that didn't disappear just because she'd stopped her obvious intrusions. I'd catch myself scanning restaurant entrances when we went out to dinner, checking my rearview mirror more frequently while driving, and feeling a spike of anxiety whenever my phone rang unexpectedly. The psychological impact of her behavior had created lasting changes in how I moved through the world, even when she wasn't actively harassing us. Cameron noticed my continued nervousness and suggested that maybe we should consider couples counseling to help us process the stress of the previous months and build better strategies for managing family conflicts in the future. "Even if my mother never causes problems again," he said, "I think we could benefit from having professional guidance on how to handle external pressures on our relationship. What she put us through was traumatic, and I want to make sure we're processing it in healthy ways." The idea of counseling felt like another sign that Cameron was taking the situation seriously and wanted to address not just his mother's behavior, but also the impact it had on our relationship dynamics. We scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a therapist who specialized in family conflict and boundary issues. During our first session, Dr. Reynolds helped us understand that what we'd experienced wasn't just difficult family dynamics, it was systematic harassment and emotional abuse. "The behaviors you're describing represent a pattern of control and manipulation that goes far beyond normal family adjustment issues," she told us. She explained that people like Veronica often responded to firm boundaries with periods of apparent compliance, but that these quiet periods were often used for planning more dramatic interventions rather than genuine self-reflection. The fact that she stopped all contact so abruptly suggests she's regrouping rather than changing. Dr. Reynolds warned us, "People who have been engaging in escalating boundary violations for months don't typically just accept limits and move on. They often interpret boundaries as challenges that require more creative approaches." Her words were sobering, but I chose to focus on the possibility that maybe Veronica was the exception. Maybe she really was using this time to reflect on her behavior and develop healthier ways to relate to us. The illusion of progress was reinforced when Veronica sent Cameron a text message during our third week of peace. The message was brief, respectful, and seemed to acknowledge her previous mistakes. "Cameron, I've been thinking about our conversation and I realize I crossed some lines that I shouldn't have. I'd like to invite you and Isabella for Sunday brunch next week so we can start over. I promise to respect your boundaries. Love, Mom." When Cameron showed me the message, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. The tone was so different from her previous communications. No manipulation, no guilt trips, no dramatic declarations about being misunderstood. It actually sounded like someone who had done some genuine self-reflection. "What do you think?" Cameron asked. "I know you have every right to say no after everything she's put us through, but this seems like it might be a genuine attempt to make amends." I studied the message again, looking for hidden meanings or subtle manipulations, but it seemed straightforward. The request was reasonable, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing was direct, and the promise to respect boundaries was exactly what we'd been asking for. Dr. Reynolds had mentioned in our sessions that healing family relationships sometimes required giving people opportunities to demonstrate changed behavior, but always with clear exit strategies if old patterns reemerged. Maybe we could try it, I said carefully. But with some conditions. It has to be somewhere public, not their apartment where we could feel trapped. And we need to agree ahead of time that if she starts her old behaviors, we leave immediately, no matter how awkward it might be. Cameron agreed to the conditions and suggested that we meet at Riverside Brunch House, a popular restaurant that would provide a public setting with built-in time limits. He texted his mother back with the suggestion, and she agreed immediately, without any pushback or attempts to negotiate. Even her response to the restaurant suggestion seemed healthy. That sounds perfect. I'm looking forward to seeing you both and starting fresh. Thank you for giving me this chance. The complete absence of her usual manipulation tactics was encouraging. There were no guilt trips about not wanting to eat her home cooking, no dramatic declarations about feeling rejected by her own son, no passive-aggressive comments about needing to meet in public because we didn't trust her. As Sunday approached, I found myself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with Veronica on healthier terms. Maybe the consequences of her behavior had finally forced her to recognize how destructive her actions had been. Maybe she really had spent these weeks reflecting on her choices and deciding to change. Cameron was more openly hopeful. I miss having a good relationship with my mother, he admitted as we got ready for brunch. I know she's done terrible things, but if she's really willing to change, I'd like to give her that opportunity. Family is important, and I want our future children to have a grandmother who respects boundaries and treats you with kindness. We arrived at Riverside Brunch House on Sunday morning feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of healing and new beginnings. The restaurant was busy with the typical weekend crowd, which made me feel safer about any potential drama. Veronica and Robert were already seated at a corner table, and when she saw us approaching, Veronica stood up with a genuine-looking smile and open arms. "Cameron, Isabella," she said warmly, "thank you so much for coming. I know I have a lot to make up for, and I'm grateful you're giving me the chance to do better." She hugged Cameron normally, no excessive clinging or dramatic declarations, and then turned to me with what seemed like genuine remorse in her eyes. "Isabella, I owe you a sincere apology for my behavior over the past few months. I crossed lines that I shouldn't have crossed, and I made you uncomfortable in your own life. That was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." The apology was direct, specific, and didn't include any justifications or excuses for her previous behavior. It was exactly the kind of accountability we'd been hoping for, and I felt a surge of relief that maybe this nightmare was really over. "Thank you for saying that, Veronica," I replied carefully. "I appreciate your apology, and I'm hopeful we can build a better relationship going forward." As we sat down for what I hoped would be a peaceful family meal, I had no idea that Veronica had spent those 2 weeks of apparent reflection planning the most shocking and destructive act of her entire campaign against us. The calm before the storm was about to end in a way that would change everything forever. The first hour of brunch at Riverside Brunch House was genuinely pleasant, which only made what happened next more shocking and devastating. Veronica seemed like a completely different person, warm, respectful, and genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationship without any of the manipulation or passive aggression that had defined her behavior for months. She asked thoughtful questions about my design work without prying into financial details, complimented Cameron on a recent promotion at work without making pointed comments about money or lifestyle changes, and even shared some funny stories about her volunteer work at the animal rescue that had us all laughing together. Robert was visibly relieved to see his wife interacting normally with us, and Cameron was practically glowing with happiness at having his mother back to what he remembered from his childhood. For the first time since our engagement, I began to understand why Cameron loved her so much and felt such loyalty to her. "This is the mother I grew up with," he whispered to me when Veronica and Robert stepped away from the table to say hello to some friends they'd spotted across the restaurant. "This is who she used to be before all the craziness started. I'm so glad you're finally getting to see this side of her." I was beginning to feel genuinely hopeful that maybe Dr. Reynolds had been wrong about people like Veronica not being capable of real change. Maybe the consequences of her behavior had shocked her into recognizing how destructive her actions had been, and she was making a genuine effort to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. When they returned to the table, Veronica suggested we order dessert to share. A lovely gesture that felt like family bonding rather than the calculated manipulation I'd grown accustomed to from her. The conversation continued to flow naturally, covering everything from wedding planning updates to Robert's upcoming retirement plans. "Isabella," Veronica said as our dessert arrived, "I want you to know how grateful I am that Cameron found someone who makes him so happy. I can see how much he loves you. And I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize what a wonderful addition you are to our family." The words felt genuine, and I found myself actually tearing up at what seemed like a real moment of connection with my future mother-in-law. "Thank you, Veronica," I said sincerely. "That means everything to me. Family is so important to both Cameron and me, and I've always hoped we could have a close relationship." It was while reaching across the table to squeeze her hand in a gesture of reconciliation that everything changed in an instant. Veronica's grip on my hand suddenly tightened beyond what was comfortable, and her entire demeanor shifted in a way that was so dramatic it was like watching someone flip a switch. The warm, apologetic expression vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that made my blood freeze. "You know, Isabella," she said, her voice still conversational but carrying an undertone that made Cameron and Robert look up in alarm. "I've been thinking a lot about this ring during our time apart." She was holding my left hand in a grip that was now painful, turning it so that my engagement ring caught the light from the restaurant's large windows. Her eyes were fixed on the diamond with an intensity that was genuinely frightening. "Cameron worked so hard for this ring," she continued, her voice getting slightly louder and attracting attention from nearby tables. 2.5 years of sacrifice, selling everything he loved, giving up his social life, his hobbies, his motorcycle, all so he could give you something beautiful enough to match your family's standards." I tried to pull my hand away, but Veronica's grip tightened even more. "Veronica, you're hurting me," I said quietly, hoping to de-escalate whatever was happening without creating a scene in the crowded restaurant. But Veronica wasn't listening. Her attention was completely focused on my ring, and she was speaking faster now, her voice taking on a manic quality that was drawing stares from other diners. "Do you know what this ring represents?" she asked, but it was clearly a rhetorical question because she didn't pause for an answer. "It represents everything Cameron gave up for you. His freedom, his independence, his connection to his real family. He changed everything about himself to buy you something expensive enough to impress your billionaire father." Cameron was trying to intervene, reaching across the table and saying, "Mom, stop, let go of Isabella's hand," but Veronica was in some kind of altered state where she couldn't hear anything except her own voice. "This ring is too valuable for someone like you," she declared, her voice now loud enough that the entire restaurant was beginning to take notice. "You wear it everywhere like it's nothing special. To work, to the grocery store, gardening, you treat it like costume jewelry instead of the precious sacrifice it really represents." That's when Veronica did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Still gripping my wrist with one hand, she used her other hand to grab my engagement ring and start trying to twist it off my finger. "This ring needs to be with someone who understands its true value," she said, yanking at the ring so violently that I could feel my finger bending in ways it wasn't supposed to. "Someone who will treasure it properly and protect Cameron's investment instead of taking it for granted." I screamed, not just from the physical pain of her trying to force the ring off my finger, but from the shock and violation of what was happening. Veronica was literally trying to steal my engagement ring in the middle of a crowded restaurant, and the look in her eyes was wild and desperate in a way that terrified me. "Cameron, help me!" I yelled as loudly as I could, using my free hand to try to pry Veronica's fingers off my wrist while she continued pulling at the ring with such force that my finger was turning purple. The entire restaurant had gone silent except for Veronica's increasingly manic declarations about how I didn't deserve the ring and how she would take better care of it. "You're selfish and spoiled," she was shouting now, "and you don't understand what real sacrifice looks like. This ring belongs with Cameron's family, where it will be properly appreciated." Cameron jumped up from his chair and grabbed his mother's arm, trying to force her to let go of me. "Mom, what the hell are you doing? Let go of Isabella right now." But Veronica was beyond reasoning. She was pulling at my ring with such violent determination that I was sure she was going to break my finger, and she was muttering under her breath about how this was justice, how she was protecting Cameron's sacrifice, how the ring needed to stay in the family where it belonged. Robert was on his feet too, shouting at his wife to stop, but Veronica seemed completely disconnected from reality. She was in some kind of manic episode where nothing existed except her obsession with taking my ring. It took both Cameron and Robert physically restraining her to finally get her to release my hand, and even then she was still reaching for the ring, clawing at the air, and screaming that I was a thief who had stolen something that rightfully belonged to her family. The scene was so shocking and violent that several other restaurant patrons had pulled out their phones to record what was happening, and someone had already called 911. The manager was rushing over to our table, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. My hand was bleeding where the ring had cut into my skin during Veronica's violent assault, and there were already dark bruises forming around my wrist where she had gripped me, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological shock of what had just happened. Veronica had just committed assault and attempted theft in front of dozens of witnesses, and she seemed to have no understanding of the magnitude of what she'd done. Even as Cameron and Robert held her back, she was still reaching toward me and declaring that she was the victim of my selfishness and greed. She doesn't deserve it, Veronica was sobbing now, but her tears seemed performative rather than genuine. Cameron gave up everything for that ring, and she treats it like garbage. I was trying to protect his investment. I was trying to save something precious from being wasted on someone who doesn't understand its value. The complete disconnect from reality was breathtaking. Veronica had just physically assaulted me and attempted to steal my engagement ring, but in her mind she was the hero of this story, protecting something valuable from someone who didn't deserve it. Cameron was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, not just anger but genuine disgust and disbelief. "Mom, you just attacked my fiancé and tried to steal her ring," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you understand what you just did? You committed a crime. In public, in front of dozens of witnesses." But Veronica wasn't listening to Cameron either. She was focused entirely on me, her eyes filled with a hatred so pure and intense that it made me physically recoil. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice carrying a menace that was somehow more frightening than her previous screaming. "That ring doesn't belong with you, and I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. You think your daddy's money protects you from consequences, but you're wrong. Some things matter more than money, and family is forever." The threats were chilling, but what scared me most was the calculation behind them. Even in the middle of what appeared to be a mental breakdown, Veronica was still strategizing, still planning her next move in what she clearly saw as a war against me and my family. As the police arrived and began taking statements from witnesses, I realized that this wasn't just a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. This was the beginning of something much more serious and dangerous. Veronica had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no going back from what had just happened in that restaurant. The false peace had been exactly that. False preparation for an attack that was more violent and public than anything I could have imagined. And judging by the look in her eyes as the police handcuffed her, this was just the beginning of Veronica's war against us. The police response to Veronica's public assault was swift and professional, but what happened during their investigation revealed just how deep her delusion ran and how she intended to continue her war against us even from custody. Officer Martinez and Officer Walsh arrived within minutes of the 911 call, and they were immediately presented with a scene that was impossible to misinterpret. Dozens of witnesses, cell phone videos of the attack, my visible injuries, and Veronica still trying to reach for my ring even while being questioned. But Veronica's response to police questioning was a masterclass in manipulation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so disturbing to witness. The moment she saw the officers, her entire demeanor shifted from manic aggression to trembling fragility. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice quivering with manufactured emotion. "I was trying to help my future daughter-in-law when she started screaming and attacking me. I think she might be having some kind of mental health crisis." The audacity was breathtaking. Veronica was attempting to flip the narrative even with multiple witnesses and video evidence of her violent assault. She claimed that I had been acting erratically during brunch, that she had only touched my hand to calm me down, and that my screaming and accusations were evidence of psychological instability. "She's been under a lot of stress lately," Veronica told the officers with convincing concern in her voice. "The pressure of planning an expensive wedding, managing her family's expectations, dealing with the responsibility of wearing such valuable jewelry every day. I was worried about her and was just trying to provide motherly support when she became violent." Officer Martinez looked at me with my bleeding finger and bruised wrist, then at Veronica, who showed no signs of injury whatsoever, and his expression made it clear he wasn't buying her story for a second. "Ma'am," he said to Veronica, "we have multiple witnesses who saw you grab Ms. Montrose's hand and attempt to remove her ring by force. We also have video footage of the incident. Your version of events doesn't match the evidence." But Veronica doubled down on her lies, adding new elements that were even more disturbing. She claimed that I had been flaunting the expensive ring inappropriately throughout brunch, making pointed comments about wealth differences, and generally behaving in a way that was emotionally abusive to her family. "She's been trying to isolate Cameron from his family ever since they got engaged," Veronica told the officers, tears streaming down her face. "She uses her father's money to control everyone around her, and when I tried to address her behavior, she started screaming and claiming I was attacking her." The systematic nature of her lies was chilling. Veronica wasn't just denying what had happened, she was constructing an elaborate alternative reality where she was the victim of my psychological manipulation, and her assault was actually self-defense against my alleged abuse. When Officer Walsh interviewed the witnesses, their accounts completely contradicted Veronica's story. The couple at the table next to us had recorded the entire incident and showed officers clear footage of Veronica grabbing my hand and violently trying to remove my ring while I screamed for help. "We heard the whole thing," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been celebrating her anniversary at a nearby table. "That woman was saying terrible things about the young lady not deserving her ring, and then she just grabbed her hand and started pulling at her jewelry. It was assault, plain and simple." Multiple witnesses described Veronica's manic behavior, her loud declarations about me not deserving the ring, and the violent nature of her attempt to steal it. Several people had started recording when they realized something was wrong, providing clear evidence of the attack. But even when confronted with witness testimony and video evidence that completely contradicted her story, Veronica refused to back down. Instead, she escalated her accusations against me, claiming that I had somehow staged the entire incident to make her look bad. "This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I was trying to address," she told the officers. "She probably planned this whole scene to turn my son against me. Rich people like her family are experts at making themselves look like victims while destroying innocent people." The conspiracy theory was so elaborate and detached from reality that even Robert looked embarrassed by his wife's behavior. When officers asked him to corroborate Veronica's version of events, he reluctantly admitted that what the witnesses described was accurate. "My wife grabbed Isabella's hand and tried to take her ring," he said quietly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I don't understand why she did it, but that's what happened. Isabella didn't do anything wrong." Robert's confirmation of the witnesses' accounts was the final nail in the coffin of Veronica's defense, but it also marked the beginning of a family schism that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Veronica was arrested on charges of assault and attempted theft, and as Officer Martinez placed her in handcuffs, she continued her performance for anyone who would listen. "This is what happens when you try to protect family from toxic people," she declared loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "My son has been brainwashed by money and manipulation, and now his own mother is being arrested for trying to save him from making the biggest mistake of his life." The scene was so dramatic and public that several restaurant patrons were still recording, creating a viral social media moment that would haunt Veronica for months to come. Videos of her manic behavior and arrest were posted on various platforms within hours, complete with captions describing the crazy mother-in-law who tried to steal an engagement ring at Sunday brunch. But Veronica's arrest was just the beginning of what would become an escalating campaign of harassment and retaliation that made her previous behavior look like minor annoyances. Within hours of posting bail the next morning, Veronica began making phone calls to everyone in Cameron's extended family, spinning an elaborate narrative about how she had been framed by my family's wealth and influence. She claimed that I had provoked the incident specifically to get her arrested, and that the charges against her were part of a coordinated attack on working-class families who dared to stand up to billionaire bullies. The calls were systematic and calculated. Veronica contacted Cameron's aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends, telling each of them a slightly different version of events, but always positioning herself as the victim of a wealthy family's revenge. "Isabella's father has enough money to buy judges and police officers," she told Cameron's Aunt Linda during a tearful phone call that Cameron overheard. "They're trying to destroy me because I saw through their daughter's manipulation and tried to protect my son from making a terrible mistake." To Cameron's cousin Jennifer, she claimed that I had been emotionally abusing Cameron for months and that her intervention at the restaurant was an attempt to save him from further psychological damage. "She's isolated him from his family, convinced him that we're not good enough for him, and now she's using her father's connections to have me criminally prosecuted for trying to help my own son." Veronica sobbed into the phone. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective. Family members who had only heard Veronica's version of events began reaching out to Cameron with concerns about our relationship and suggestions that maybe he should reconsider the engagement. His uncle Tom called to say that maybe Veronica had a point about class differences creating problems, and that perhaps Cameron should think carefully about whether marrying into such a wealthy family was really in his best interests. His cousin Mike sent a text suggesting that pressing criminal charges against family was going too far, and that maybe we should all sit down and work things out like adults instead of involving the legal system. Even some of Cameron's childhood friends began questioning whether the situation was as black and white as it appeared, having been influenced by Veronica's carefully crafted narrative about being persecuted by powerful people who didn't want her in their son's life. The psychological pressure was intense and systematic. Veronica was using every relationship Cameron valued to create doubt about our engagement and my character, forcing him to choose between believing his own eyes and maintaining connections with people he'd known his entire life. But what made the harassment campaign even more devastating was that Veronica began targeting my family and professional relationships as well. She somehow obtained contact information for several of my design clients and began calling them with concerns about my emotional stability and professional reliability. "I'm worried about Isabella," she told Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned a small bakery I'd helped rebrand. "She's been under a lot of stress lately, and I've noticed some concerning behavioral changes. As someone who cares about her, I thought you should know that she might not be in the best state of mind to handle important business decisions right now." The calls were designed to plant seeds of doubt about my professional competence while maintaining plausible deniability about their true purpose. Veronica presented herself as a concerned family member rather than a vindictive attacker, making it difficult for my clients to dismiss her warnings outright. When Mrs. Rodriguez called to ask if I was okay and whether I needed to take a break from work to deal with personal issues, I realized that Veronica's campaign had expanded beyond family relationships to target my livelihood and professional reputation. The most disturbing escalation came when Veronica began calling my parents' house directly, leaving rambling voicemails about how they had raised a manipulative and cruel daughter who was destroying an innocent family for her own selfish purposes. "Your daughter is a sociopath," said one message left at 2 a.m. "She orchestrated this entire situation to make me look crazy, and now she's using your money and influence to destroy a working mother who was just trying to protect her son. You should be ashamed of what you've raised." The voicemails became increasingly unhinged and threatening, with Veronica making vague references to consequences and justice that would eventually find our family, regardless of how much money we had to protect ourselves. When my father heard these messages, his response was immediate and decisive. The period of trying to handle Veronica through normal legal channels was over. She had made the fatal mistake of threatening his family directly, and Alexander Montrose was about to demonstrate exactly what that meant. The war Veronica thought she was winning was about to turn against her in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. My father's response to Veronica's threatening voicemails and harassment campaign was swift, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Within 48 hours of listening to her 2 a.m. rants about destroying our family, Dad had assembled a team of investigators who uncovered information about Veronica's life that even Robert didn't know existed. But Dad didn't act immediately. Alexander Montrose hadn't built a real estate empire by being impulsive or emotional. Instead, he spent a week methodically gathering intelligence about every aspect of Veronica's financial, professional, and personal situation, looking for pressure points that could be used to end her harassment campaign permanently. What his investigators discovered was shocking even to me. Veronica's carefully constructed image as a hard-working, financially responsible woman was built on a foundation of lies, fraud, and deception that had been years in the making. The apartment she and Robert lived in at Oakwood Gardens wasn't just their home, it was a rent-controlled unit that Veronica had obtained through fraudulent means. She had lied on her rental application about her employment history, forged Robert's signature on financial documents, and had been systematically violating the terms of her lease for over 3 years. But the most damaging discovery was that Veronica had been illegally subletting portions of their apartment to temporary tenants without informing the property management company or including Robert on the rental agreements. She had been pocketing the subletting income while claiming financial hardship to justify late rent payments and requests for lease modifications. Dad's investigators found that Veronica had been running this illegal subletting operation for almost 2 years, generating approximately $800 per month in unreported income, while simultaneously claiming to struggle financially and asking Cameron for monetary help during family emergencies. The financial fraud went deeper than just housing. Veronica had been using Robert's Social Security number to open credit accounts without his knowledge, had forged his signature on loan applications, and had been intercepting his mail to hide the full extent of their debt from him. Most devastatingly, she had taken out a second mortgage on a property that Robert thought they owned free and clear, his late mother's house that he had inherited and planned to leave to Cameron. Veronica had forged the necessary documents to secure a $45,000 loan against the property and had been using the money to fund her spending habits while letting Robert believe their financial situation was stable. But Dad's most powerful discovery was that Veronica had been lying about her employment status for months. She claimed to be working part-time as a medical receptionist, but she had actually been fired from her last 3 jobs for various infractions including theft of office supplies, inappropriate use of patient information, and harassment of coworkers. The medical practice where she claimed to currently work had no record of ever employing anyone named Veronica Ashworth, and her references from previous positions were entirely fabricated. She had been unemployed for over 6 months while telling Robert and Cameron that she was contributing financially to their household. Armed with this information, Dad made a single phone call that would change Veronica's life forever. But he didn't call Veronica directly, and he didn't call her employer or creditors. Instead, he called Marcus Wellington, the property manager of Oakwood Gardens apartment complex. "Marcus," Dad said during what I can only imagine was a very cordial conversation, "I'm calling about one of your tenants, Veronica Ashworth, in Unit 247. I have some concerns about possible lease violations and fraudulent activity that you might want to investigate." Dad didn't threaten or demand anything. He simply provided Marcus with documented evidence of Veronica's illegal subletting operation, her fraudulent rental application, and her violation of multiple lease terms. The evidence was presented as a concerned citizen bringing potential fraud to the attention of the appropriate authorities. Marcus Wellington thanked Dad for the information and promised to look into the matter immediately. What Dad didn't mention was that Montrose Holdings owned the property management company that managed Oakwood Gardens, making Marcus Wellington one of his employees. The investigation into Veronica's lease violations began that same afternoon. Property management conducted a surprise inspection of Unit 247 and discovered not only evidence of unauthorized subletting, but also significant damage to the apartment that Veronica had been hiding from management for months. The inspection revealed that Veronica had removed walls to create additional sleeping areas for her illegal tenants, had installed unauthorized electrical modifications that violated building codes, and had been operating what essentially amounted to an unlicensed boarding house in violation of city housing regulations. But Dad wasn't finished. While property management was discovering the extent of Veronica's housing fraud, Dad was making additional phone calls to other relevant parties who might be interested in Veronica's pattern of deceptive behavior. The IRS received detailed documentation about Veronica's unreported subletting income and her use of false Social Security numbers on financial applications. The information was presented as a routine report of suspected tax fraud, with no mention of any personal connection to the case. The bank that held Robert's mortgage received evidence that Veronica had forged signatures on loan documents and had been operating an illegal business out of the mortgaged property without proper disclosure. Again, this was presented as routine fraud reporting rather than personal retaliation. The most devastating call went to the State Licensing Board for Medical Office personnel. Dad's investigators had discovered that Veronica had been falsely claiming employment at medical practices and had been using patient information from previous jobs to enhance her credibility with potential employers. This wasn't just employment fraud, it was a violation of healthcare privacy laws that carried serious criminal penalties. The licensing board opened an immediate investigation that would prevent Veronica from ever working in healthcare again. The response to Dad's information sharing was swift and overwhelming. Within 72 hours, Veronica received a notice to quit from Oakwood Gardens Property Management, giving her 30 days to vacate the premises due to serious lease violations and fraudulent rental activity. The notice detailed every violation Dad's investigators had uncovered: unauthorized subletting, property damage, fraudulent application information, and operation of an illegal business on the premises. The documentation was so thorough and damning that there was no possibility of appeal or negotiation. Simultaneously, the bank that held the mortgage on Robert's inherited property initiated foreclosure proceedings based on the fraudulent loan application and Veronica's misrepresentation of the property's usage. The $45,000 she had borrowed against the house was immediately called due, with full payment required within 15 days. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating blow was the IRS audit notice that arrived the same day as the eviction notice. Veronica was being investigated for tax evasion, fraud, and identity theft related to her use of Robert's information on financial documents. The audit would freeze their bank accounts pending resolution, making it impossible for Veronica to access the money she had hidden from Robert or to continue her illegal financial activities. When these notices arrived, Veronica's carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation collapsed in a single day. She went from believing she was winning a war against my family to facing eviction, foreclosure, criminal charges, and complete financial ruin. But Dad still wasn't finished. The final piece of his strategy was ensuring that Veronica's professional reputation was permanently destroyed within her community. Phone calls went out to every medical practice, property management company, and small business in Rosewood Springs, alerting them to be cautious about hiring someone with Veronica's pattern of fraud and deception. These calls weren't threats or demands, they were simply professional courtesy warnings about a potential employee who had demonstrated a pattern of theft, fraud, and harassment that made her unsuitable for positions of trust. The effectiveness of Dad's approach was that none of it was personal revenge or illegal retaliation. Every action was a legitimate response to documented fraud and criminal behavior that Veronica had actually committed. The evidence was real, the violations were serious, and the consequences were simply the natural result of her own choices finally catching up with her. When Veronica realized what was happening, her response was exactly what Dad had predicted. Instead of accepting responsibility for her fraudulent behavior, she immediately blamed our family for her problems and began making increasingly desperate attempts to portray herself as the victim of wealthy people's abuse of power. She called local news stations claiming she was being persecuted for standing up to billionaire bullies, contacted legal aid organizations seeking help fighting against what she called economic terrorism, and even tried to organize a social media campaign about rich families destroying working people's lives. But Veronica's attempts to gain sympathy were undermined by the overwhelming evidence of her own criminal behavior. Every news outlet that looked into her claims discovered the documented fraud, the forged signatures, and the illegal activities that had triggered the legitimate investigations. Rather than appearing to be a victim of wealthy people's revenge, Veronica looked like a criminal who was finally facing consequences for years of illegal behavior. The most damaging revelation came when local media discovered the restaurant video of Veronica's assault on me. The footage of her violent attempt to steal my engagement ring, combined with the evidence of her extensive fraud, painted a picture of someone whose claims of victimhood were completely inconsistent with her actual behavior. Dad's strategy was working perfectly. Veronica was being destroyed not by illegal retaliation or abuse of power, but by the systematic exposure of her own criminal actions and the natural consequences of choices she had made long before she ever met our family. But the complete unraveling of her life was just beginning, and Veronica's desperation would soon drive her to make decisions that would finish destroying everything she had left. The complete collapse of Veronica's fraudulent empire happened with a speed that shocked everyone, including those of us who knew it was coming. Within 2 weeks of Dad's phone calls, Veronica went from believing she was winning a war against my family to facing complete financial ruin, criminal charges, and the destruction of every relationship she had manipulated for years. The eviction from Oakwood Gardens was just the beginning. When property management conducted their final inspection of Unit 247, they discovered damage so extensive that Veronica was being held liable for over $25,000 in repair costs beyond her security deposit. The unauthorized electrical work had created fire hazards that required complete rewiring, and the wall modifications had compromised the structural integrity of the unit. But the most devastating discovery came when maintenance workers found hidden cameras that Veronica had installed to monitor her illegal subletting tenants. The cameras had also been recording Robert without his knowledge, capturing private conversations and personal activities that Veronica had apparently been using to control him for years. The revelation of the hidden surveillance equipment added new criminal charges to Veronica's growing legal problems: invasion of privacy, illegal recording, and operating an unlicensed surveillance business. Robert was horrified to learn that his own wife had been spying on him in their home, recording his phone calls and potentially using the footage to manipulate their relationship. When Robert discovered the full extent of Veronica's deception, the forged signatures, the secret debts, the fraudulent employment claims, and now the hidden cameras, he made the devastating decision to file for divorce and cooperate fully with all criminal investigations against his wife. "I don't know who this woman is," Robert told Cameron during a heartbreaking phone conversation. "The person I married wouldn't steal from her own family, wouldn't commit fraud, and certainly wouldn't spy on me in my own home. I feel like I've been living with a stranger for years." Robert's decision to divorce Veronica and testify against her criminal activities was the final blow to her support system. She had lost her housing, her income, her family, and now her marriage, all within a matter of weeks. But Veronica's response to this complete destruction of her life was to double down on her delusions and escalate her attacks on our family in ways that were increasingly desperate and dangerous. She hired Marcus Pemberton, a barely competent attorney who advertised on late-night television, using money borrowed from a payday loan company at astronomical interest rates. Pemberton filed a lawsuit against my father, my family, and me personally, claiming damages for conspiracy, harassment, economic terrorism, and intentional destruction of reputation. The lawsuit was so poorly written and legally frivolous that it read more like a conspiracy theory manifesto than an actual legal document. Veronica claimed that my father had orchestrated a criminal conspiracy to destroy her life because she had exposed my manipulative behavior and protected Cameron from making a terrible mistake. The complaint included wild allegations about Dad bribing government officials, paying off property managers, and using his wealth to influence law enforcement investigations. It demanded $2.3 million in damages, coincidentally, exactly the amount that Dad's company was worth according to public records. But the lawsuit backfired spectacularly. When legitimate attorneys reviewed the complaint, they immediately recognized it as the work of someone who was either completely incompetent or dealing with a client who was detached from reality. The local legal community began circulating the lawsuit as an example of frivolous litigation, and several news outlets picked up the story as a human interest piece about the dangers of letting personal vendettas spiral out of control. The media coverage was devastating for Veronica because it included not only her ridiculous legal claims, but also the documented evidence of her criminal behavior that had triggered the legitimate investigations. Side-by-side comparisons of her lawsuit allegations and the actual evidence of her fraud made her look delusional at best and criminally manipulative at worst. The final blow to Veronica's credibility came when Cameron held a press conference to publicly distance himself from his mother's behavior and support the criminal charges against her. "My mother has committed serious crimes," Cameron said in a statement that was covered by every local news outlet. "She assaulted my fiancé, attempted to steal her engagement ring, and has been lying to our family about her financial and employment situation for years. The consequences she's facing are the result of her own choices, not persecution by my fiancé's family." Cameron's public statement was devastating because it came from the person Veronica claimed to be protecting. Her own son was confirming that her behavior was criminal and that her claims of victimhood were false. The psychological impact of losing Cameron's support completely shattered what remained of Veronica's facade. She began making increasingly erratic public appearances, showing up at places where she knew Cameron and I might be, screaming about conspiracy theories and family betrayal. The most disturbing incident happened when Veronica appeared at my design studio during a client meeting, wearing what appeared to be the same clothes she'd worn for several days, demanding to speak with me about resolving our differences like adults. When I refused to engage with her and asked her to leave, Veronica began shouting about how I had destroyed her family and stolen her son, attracting attention from everyone in the building. Security had to escort her out while she continued screaming threats about legal consequences and karmic justice. The final confrontation came during Veronica's criminal trial for the restaurant assault. Representing herself after Marcus Pemberton withdrew from her case when she stopped paying his fees, Veronica used her opening statement to launch into a rambling speech about wealthy families destroying working people and conspiracy theories about judicial corruption. The judge, the Honorable Sarah Chen, initially showed patience with Veronica's self-representation, but her behavior became so disruptive and inappropriate that she was eventually held in contempt of court multiple times. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the restaurant security footage, testimony from dozens of witnesses, medical evidence of my injuries, and expert testimony about the force required to cause the damage to my finger and wrist. But instead of mounting any kind of coherent defense, Veronica used her time in court to make increasingly wild accusations about my family's criminal conspiracy against her, claiming that the restaurant video had been digitally altered and that all the witnesses had been paid to lie. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: assault, attempted theft, and harassment. Judge Chen sentenced Veronica to 14 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation with a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with Cameron, me, or any member of my family. Additionally, Veronica was ordered to undergo mandatory psychological evaluation and anger management treatment and to pay restitution for my medical expenses and the therapy costs associated with the trauma of her assault. But even after her conviction and sentencing, Veronica remained convinced that she was the victim of a vast conspiracy. Her final statement to the court was a rambling speech about how she was being imprisoned for trying to protect her family from evil people who buy justice with money. The most heartbreaking part of the entire ordeal was watching Robert process the destruction of his marriage and his realization that the woman he'd loved and protected for years was someone he'd never really known. "I enabled her behavior for so long," Robert told us during one of our few conversations after the trial. "I thought I was protecting someone who needed help, but I was actually helping someone who was hurting other people. I'm sorry it took me so long to see the truth." Robert sold the house he'd inherited from his mother to pay off the fraudulent debts Veronica had accumulated in his name, and he moved to Arizona to live with his sister while he rebuilt his life. He maintained a relationship with Cameron, but the trust and family bond had been permanently damaged by years of manipulation and lies. As for Veronica, she served her full sentence in county jail, during which time she continued to write letters to anyone who would listen, claiming she was a political prisoner being held because she'd stood up to wealthy criminals. The letters were so delusional and threatening that they resulted in additional charges for harassment and violation of the restraining order, extending her sentence and ensuring that her parole would be heavily supervised. When she was finally released, Veronica discovered that her criminal record, combined with the extensive media coverage of her case, had made her essentially unemployable in Rosewood Springs. No property management company would rent to her, no employer would hire her, and even legal aid organizations refused to help her appeal her conviction. She eventually left town, and the last we heard, she was living in a homeless shelter 3 states away, still maintaining social media accounts where she posts conspiracy theories about wealthy families and claims that she's the victim of ongoing persecution. Cameron and I were married 6 months after Veronica's trial, in a beautiful ceremony attended by family and friends who had supported us through the nightmare. My engagement ring, which had been the catalyst for so much drama and violence, became a symbol of our ability to survive external pressures and build something beautiful together despite the chaos around us. Dr. Reynolds, the therapist who had helped us navigate the crisis, attended our wedding and remarked that our experience, while traumatic, had actually strengthened our relationship by forcing us to communicate clearly, set firm boundaries, and support each other through genuine adversity. "Most couples never face anything as challenging as what you've been through," she told us during our final session. "The fact that you came through it with your love and trust intact is proof that your relationship can survive anything life throws at you." Looking back now, I can see that Veronica's obsession with my engagement ring was never really about the ring itself. It was about her inability to accept that Cameron had chosen to build a life with someone else, her resentment about economic differences she couldn't control, and her desperate need to maintain control over relationships through manipulation and guilt. The ring just became the symbol of everything she felt entitled to but couldn't have, and her attempt to steal it was the moment when her internal delusions crashed into external reality in a way that destroyed everything she'd built through years of lies and manipulation. Today, Cameron and I live quietly in Rosewood Springs, surrounded by friends and family who love and support us. We've learned to appreciate the peaceful moments, to protect our privacy more carefully, and to never take for granted the simple joy of building a life together without external drama. And yes, I still wear my engagement ring every single day, because it represents not just Cameron's love and sacrifice, but our ability to protect what matters most from people who would destroy it for their own selfish purposes. The nightmare is over, but the lessons learned will last a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.